Hi guys, today we're going to talk about traditional tales and modern fantasy in regards to children's literature. Let's get started. Well, here's the introduction. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, a storyteller told a story to a group of people. These people told others and so on, and these became the traditional tales as we know them today. Traditional tales were often told in the oral tradition, because obviously there was no writing. Um, Many elements from these traditional tales ended up finding their way into modern fantasy stories of today. Since they share so many elements, they've been combined into one chapter. So first we're going to talk about traditional tales because they came first. So what is a traditional tale? A traditional tale is a tale that has been passed down through the oral tradition before being written down. The stories often contain fantastic and magical elements. There are many characteristics of a traditional tale. First of all, they have a simple story structure. The character, setting, and problem are all quickly identified, the climax is reached quickly, and the conflicts are resolved quickly. It's a fast-moving, short little story. The characters are often one-dimensional. They're typically either good or evil. This helps the readers identify them easily. They often have indistinct settings, which means that the settings are not easily identified. They're often told like a land far, far away or deep in the woods, but never said specifically where these places are at. This is perhaps because the stories traveled from land to land through the oral tradition as people traveled. Another characteristic of traditional tales is the succinct language. They have a standard beginning, once upon a time in a land from far, far away, and contain simple pattern endings, and they lived happily ever after. The phrases are often repeated in most of the stories. They have predictable themes. Good always triumphs over evil. Hard work always pays off. You should listen to your parents, etc., etc. And they always have happy endings. And they lived happily ever after. There are many different types of traditional tales covered in the book. The first one we're going to talk about is folk tales. These are cumulative tales which invite the listeners to join in through the use of repeated phrases. The most notable one is probably the gingerbread man, like run, run as fast as you can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man. It's said over and over and over, which invites the listener to join in. The next folk tale is beast tales. These are tales about humans with about animals with human characteristics. The animals behave like humans would instead of like animals do in our everyday world. Next we have Pourquoi tales. These are tales about why and how things are the way they are in the natural world. These include like how the sun got so high or how the world came to be and things like that. Next we have nonsense tales, which are another type of folk tale. These focus on foolish characters who make mistakes. And then we have trickster tales. These are the tales of a trickster animal who outwits all of the other animals. Like foxes are usually tricksters in folk tales. Another good example is Anansi the spider. He's a trickster in traditional African tales. Next we have another type of traditional tale is fairy tales. These are magical folk tales containing witches, fairies, princesses, etc. This is where like Cinderella would fall in, Hansel and Gretel, stories like that would fall under this. Next we have fables. These are tales with a moral lesson contained within the story, and they usually end with, and the moral of the story is, and then it's spelled out for the reader. The most recognizable of these fables would be Aesop's fables. Then we have legends. These are stories of supposedly real individuals who achieved great things. The most recognizable type of legends, perhaps in the United States, would be tall tales, which is where like Paul Bunyan comes in. Now we're going to talk about modern fantasy. Modern fantasy are stories that contain one or more elements that only exist in the imagination of the author or the reader. They can be set in the real world or in fantastic lands created by the author. Because most of the elements are the same as they are in traditional tales, I didn't make a separate slide for that. They're the same. But we have different types of modern fantasy, and some of these are going to be the same, but some are different. Like animal fantasy are stories about animals with human characteristics. These are the most popular choices for read alouds to small children. Because, I mean, who doesn't like fuzzy little animals? Next, we have humorous fantasy. These are stories that are humorous or overly exaggerated. They have fast-paced plots, funny and strange characters, and funny situations, etc. A good example of this would be like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It's a fast-paced story. It's very funny, but obviously not everything in Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory is real, because we don't have a wonderful magical chocolate factory like that, even though I wish we did. Then we have magic adventure and toy fantasy. These are stories where toys come to life and go on amazing adventures. A great example of this would be the book that we're reading for this class, which is the Edward Trulane book. He is a little China rabbit who comes to life and has all sorts of adventures. Then we have ghost fantasy. These are ghost stories with supernatural happenings. They don't necessarily have to be horror stories, they just have to contain some sort of supernatural element. And then we have high fantasy. These are when characters go on important quests to other worlds or in other worlds. A good example of this would be The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy travels from Kansas to the land of Oz and has to go on a great quest to get home from Oz. Then we have time travel fantasy. These involve characters who travel through time, going either into the future or the past. Most of them take place in the past. These are different from historical fiction because the characters are not living in that time period. They are from a different time period and traveling to the past, and so that makes them different, but they contain a lot of the same elements as historical fiction. Then we have science fantasy, which is the same thing as science fiction. These blend science and fantasy with reality. They often raise questions about the future. A great example of this would be The Giver by Lois Lowry. It involves a future where like not everyone is. Oh, and then we have vocabulary and the conclusion and the book bibliography, which we can click on now and go through. Woohoo! Oh, it's going to open up twice. Okay, 1 and 2. All right. The first one I selected was The Tale of Peter Rabbit. It's an animal fantasy book. I picked this one because it shows that not all fantasy books have to be for the upper level grades. Peter Rabbit is a small story that is enjoyed by small children. Next, in the same vein, this is an animal fantasy book as well. I chose Redwall by Brian Jakes. And then there's a clickable link in the actual PowerPoint if you want to go through and read all of these. For humorous fantasy, I chose James and the Giant Peach. For ghost fantasy, I chose The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. And for high fantasy, I chose Abarat by Clive Barker, which is a great book if you ever had the chance to read it. And then for fairy tales, I chose Yummy by Lucy Collins, who is the author of the Maisie series. That's why her artwork looks so recognizable. And that is it. I hope you learned something about traditional tales and modern fantasy. Thank you for watching, and I will upload. You can obviously go back through and look at the actual slides if you need to go through at a slower pace, or you need to look at something again. Alright, thank you.